Unison's national executive, and I too was at TUC conference that we've been talking about. I mean, first of all, obviously, I'd like to say thanks for the invite to come and speak here, and that I'm very much looking forward to hearing. I mean, I think there's quite a lot of cross-fertilisation amongst the panel of what we've got to say, but hearing from people from the floor as well, because it's such a central issue at the moment. Because, of course, the cost of living crisis means that whilst working class people are struggling to make ends meet and using food banks and choosing between heating and eating, we're told that there's no money, and that there's no money to pay workers in the NHS, in transport, in post, in education, you name it, and therefore we have no alternative but to take a pay cut in real terms. My day job, I work for a local council, and in the last decade we've lost over 20% of our pay in real terms. Locally in our branch we call it pay-free Fridays, where you go into work or log on a Friday morning and you spend the rest of the day working for nothing compared to what you did 10 years ago. And actually now the Tories are coming for our Thursdays as well. And I think it's not at all surprising that we're seeing millions of workers saying that enough is enough. On the 1st of February, we're actually going to see something like 500,000 workers on strike in this country, one of the biggest days of action that we've seen for years. And I think it's really important that we look at how we can put forward those arguments about where money comes from, how it's used, and us having some say over that as well. And the strikes and protests are a really good place for doing that. But of course it's made even worse as an argument, isn't it? Because we know that there is plenty of money. It's not true that there's no money for the things that we need. There's more billionaires than we've ever seen before. The number of billionaires shot up in the pandemic. And of course, there's not just more of them, but they've got even more money than they had before as well. They ended the cap on city fat caps on the bonuses that they get last year, and they now are getting bonuses back to the levels of before the 2008 crash. And of course that's before we even consider the profits of the energy companies. We've got the richest ever Prime Minister and a Tory party chair, Nadine Zahawi, who's just been caught out owing millions in taxes, as if having installed central heating in his stables for his horses wasn't bad enough. This is, an elite, entitled government who have no concept of how the rest of us live and are constantly looking at how they make themselves richer and make their friends and the companies and the institutions that back them richer as well. But of course, there is one area, isn't there, as people have been talking about during today, where spending public money has been huge, and that is the defence budget. Sophie mentioned that they're getting towards spending £50 billion this year, and of course it is very directly money that could be used on welfare, on wages, on ending fuel and food poverty. There's a generation of kids who are growing up in poverty, and actually if defence spending went into welfare and into public services, they probably wouldn't know what a food bank is, and yet there is something like 4 million of people using food banks at the moment. So clearly this is money that could be used for public good, not for death and destruction. And of course, and this is where you then get the argument, isn't it? It's how when the government's reducing public spending and therefore our jobs could be at risk. Trade unions look to how we can fight to save jobs and how we can get investment. But I do think it's important that we say that defence spending and the arms industry isn't the same as other manufacturing industries or public service. And I think it's also worth saying as well that workers in the arms industries aren't actually defence workers. They weren't born and decided that they wanted to be a defence worker. They're actually skilled engineers quite often. And the people who happen to work in the defence industry because that's the biggest employees in their areas, or where there's most jobs, or where they can get a decent wage. And I think it's also not good enough to use defending or saving jobs though, or the manufacturing industry as a cover for spending on the arms industry, because that was the argument that initially it seemed was being put at the TUC conference that we're talking about, because the motion was called economic recovery and manufacturing jobs, and that sounds very, very innocuous, doesn't it? It sounds like the kind of thing that any trade unionist would be supporting. You then went on to read it. I mean, somebody mentioned in one of the sessions earlier, it was very much a motion in two parts because it was a motion that came from two different unions in it. But there were parts in it that welcomed the AUKUS agreement as an opportunity for manufacturing orders, argued that defence cuts weaken the ability for the UK to aid Ukrainian people, made a direct link between investing in those jobs and the war in Ukraine, demanded support for a campaign for an increase in defence spending and a 30-year commitment to defence work and contracts. This is no little thing, you know, it's a whole generation of work. And of course this was overturning what had been TUC policy passed in 2017 of moving away from defence manufacturing. Part of the argument that's always put, and was put there, was that defence spending would see a relatively high tax return and therefore would not only retain and create jobs, but would also help fund public services. And it's worth people just knowing as well, because I mean, I said I was at the conference and our delegation was sitting right at the front. So when they called the vote, we turned around, and actually, from delegates on the conference floor, the motion was lost. It was only when it then went to be called to a card vote that it was then passed, and you could see how important it was, what happened in the unions, particularly the bigger unions, which I think is one of the things we have to think about going away from today. And of course, those arguments though about retaining and creating jobs and funding public services, I do think there's a lot of problems with them. Because, I mean, as I mentioned already, there's plenty of money in society. It's about who has it and who controls it. And of course, it would be entirely possible to raise the kind of taxes for public services that we're told can only come from defence spending by actually taxing those energy companies, by taxing the individuals and other companies that avoid paying their taxes as well. And then you look at some of the detail of the cost of some of those defence jobs and defence contracts and the rest of it. There was research done a few years ago into a claim that Lockheed Martin, you know, one of the huge US arms and defence companies, they produced, it was at the time the all-singing, all-dancing fighter jet, the F-35, and they argued that it created and supported jobs. They said there was something like 125,000 jobs per jet. There's quite intense, detailed research into this, and actually they found that the cost was, the number of jobs was nearer to 50,000, so less than half that number. At the time, the jet costed $400 billion to build. So even if you take their figures, rather than the figures that the researchers found, each job was going to cost somewhere between $3.2 million. If you took the figures that the research found, it was actually $8 million per job. This is not really an efficient or effective way of creating jobs, is it? And similarly, actually, if you look at closer to home, at Trident, again, there was a report some years ago by Scottish TUC who said that if Trident was scrapped, the reduction in direct and indirect jobs across Scotland will be less than 2,000, and that would only start to kick in a few years later. They estimated that the running cost at that time was 1.8 billion, again meaning that every Trident job cost about £1 million. At the time, the most expensive jobs funded by the state. Of course, it doesn't come to us, you know, we don't, none of our mates, you know, get £1 million for their jobs, whatever. But you feel that people could do almost any other job. I can't see what this is. Oh, okay. You can do just about any other job and get a higher salary than those, and that's without looking at the running. I have to speed up now. Without looking at the renewal and running costs of it. But you know, you can see how you can take a fraction of that spending. You could easily generate loads and loads more jobs. I think the important thing then to rush on, I'll only skate over it because I suspect Andrew will talk a bit more about it. But there is alternatives. Somebody mentioned the Lucas plan earlier. Are you going to talk a bit about that?
I'm going to pump that over to Hillary.
Okay. Well, the Lucas plan, we should have talked more before, obviously. But it was a trade union response to reconfiguring, repurposing the defence industry. It was a union-led alternative, let's say, in the 70s. 50% of Lucas's work was on military contracts. And when jobs were at risk, actually the shop stewards and union organisation there came up with something like 150 different proposals about alternative products they could make that were socially useful and all the rest of it, and start to show that something different could be done. There's been research done in the US when they were closing military bases, started at the end of the 80s. And again, they found that a lot of those areas, physically, but also the jobs that people did were turned into research or manufacturing hubs, into hospitals, college buildings. Something like 99% of directly employed jobs were replaced. Now, and of course, the other thing is there's a session earlier on the climate industry, but actually the work that the Campaign Against Climate Change Trade Union Group has done in terms of looking at a just transition and it's a million climate jobs, I think is a real model for how we can look at repurposing the defence industry as well. You know, speaks in there, talks about how linked the climate change and war are, and actually I think we can see a real way to look forward through some of those. And of course, you know, because of course there is some manufacturing that we do want and that don't cost so much. We do want the wind turbine, we do want the medical equipment that we saw being made during the pandemic by sections of the defence industry. And I mean, actually, it would be fantastic, wouldn't it, if we could have solar panels made without using forced labour, use some of those some of those resources to do that, to keep people alive rather than killing them. So I guess I'll try and sum up then, as I'm getting nose waved at me. But the arms industry, I think, is a very different kind of industry to general manufacturing. It's an industry that makes a few people, a few companies, and a few states billions. But actually, millions of working class people pay for it with their lives, with their homes, and with the world that we live in. So when a trade union proposes that our movement has to support a call for more arms spending to protect jobs, we have to put the case against it. We can't say that we'll fight for defence jobs here if the end result is people dying in Yemen or Ukraine. We can't support investing in an industry that means working class people are being killed as our rules fight for control of the world. And, you know, it's a time when Hunt is saying that they're going to increase defence spending by 1.5 billion over the next 2 years, ironically using the argument that that has to be done to keep ahead of inflation, which is the exact opposite from what, you know, the reason we're told that wages have to stay down is because that would cause inflation. We can't stand on the same side as a government saying that there has to be the funding in those jobs. It's a government attacking workers at home and abroad, and they are not our friends. They are not the side that we stand on. And I think I'll finish with, like Andrew, Keir Starmer's my MP, and I think the role that he's played in actually stopping people speaking out in the Labour Party against war has had a real impact actually on our ability to publicise and to get a bigger movement going. That's why the conferences like today are really important. It's really important that one of the things we take away is what can we do in our unions to try and build that movement. And John McLean, the Scottish socialist and opponent of the First World War, he said that a bayonet is a weapon with a worker at either end. The wars of today may not be fought with bayonets, but it's still true that it's workers at either end who suffer. And I think that's why we have to try and win a side of the trade union movement from the bottom up in our branches and win that side against the war, go back to the TUC and challenge it again and actually take on the system that breeds war time and time again.